working with biotech companies and supporting their messaging, positioning, fundraising through Series A, B, C, et cetera, rounds, taking them public, making sure they have a strong public presence when they are, on the markets and whatnot, and sort of facilitating their relationships with the financial community and making sure those are strong going forward. So that's what I do now today in New York City, both remotely and sort of in the in-person world. Our office is also based in New York as well. And then before that, I was at the New York City Economic Development Corporation, working with Rich, his team, along with my city colleagues, and Glennis, your sort of, I guess, predecessors at the BioLabs, working with everybody across the New York City life sciences community from the city agency side, so really working to build the biotech community here in New York City, whether, from the real estate perspective, from the startup perspective, financing perspective, and whatnot. So that's sort of me. Thanks for having me. I'll pass it along back to you.
Sounds great. And Glennis, you're equally VIP and have been just such a great, I know you're new to the program, but been such a great partner. And one thing which we'll talk about that you've done has just been tremendously helpful. But thrilled to have you here. And if you could give your background, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me. And thanks, Rich and your team at Upper West. This has been a very short but wonderful experience working with you guys. So my background is pretty nonlinear. I currently am the director of BioLabs at NYULangone, which is an incubator, 40,000 to 50,000 square foot incubator space in Soho. Prior to this, I was doing strategy innovation consulting around translating innovation and mapping innovations for acquisitions. Most of my clients were Fortune 500 companies and also startups. So I was just helping people leverage the assets or acquire assets around nascent technologies. Most of that work was primarily on the consumer side of things, even when it was for pharma companies. Skincare, nutraceuticals, etc., disease prediction modeling. Prior to that consulting effort, I actually had my own company in India, of all places. I was there for 7 years, and that was a company primarily involved in drug discovery, functional genomics platform, and we were exclusively licensing technologies from Europe and the US to help drug discovery in the Indian market for the Indian market, which was very different and still is from what anyone is doing there. Thankfully, I had an exit, didn't have as many zeros as I thought when I started the company in India with my partners, but it was an exit nonetheless. And it afforded me to be able to, make choices and go into consulting as I did. Prior to that, I was actually in the Columbia University Tech Ventures Group, managing chemistry and biology departments, and again, helping them translate innovation. So the IP and new company ideas that were coming out of chemistry and biology from the faculty and students, I would work with them on mapping IP strategy and also marketing those innovations for potential licensing opportunity with larger pharma companies and larger industrial companies. And before that, PhD from Columbia in the neurobiology and behavior program. Thankfully, and feel very privileged at the time I was in that program, we had 3 Nobel laureates come out of that that period. And it was a wonderful, exciting time to be in neurobiology because, again, innovation was driving a lot of the discoveries that were being made that were stagnant for probably more than a century. And so because of innovation, we were able to, as a discipline, finally tackle some questions that we couldn't before. And so I keep saying innovation, 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 but I'm very much rooted in the power and impact that can bring for myself and the greater society. And so most of that has propelled my career.
Great. And Danielle, as I said before, this is our first meeting actually where we can see each other. We've emailed a ton and spoken on the phone. But so new VIP status for you, but you've been a fabulous partner, and really our program can't exist without the companies that are hiring interns. And you've just been a great partner in that respect, and really, really appreciate that. I'd love to hear your background.
Yeah, no, of course. No, we've obviously brought on many interns from the LifeSci New York City internship program, and they've all been fabulous. And several of them are now full-time employees of ours. But you know, taking a step back, I guess, to go chronologically here. So I went to Penn for undergrad. I studied operations at Wharton and bioengineering in the engineering school. Then did my master's in bioengineering before joining McKinsey, where I was for 2.5 years, exclusively focused in pharma med products. I was based in New York, traveled around, you know, working at companies, both, you know, in the New York area, of course, Boston, of course, you know, the Chicago area, and many other places. And then I was found by a headhunter working for Vant Sciences based in New York. And they were very persistent coming after me to join this new Vant Health business unit they were building out. And the goal of that group, Vant overall, is like actually a pretty young company. They just celebrated their 7-year anniversary. But about 2 years ago, they pivoted from, you know, just being a company starting small pharma companies to also starting small health tech companies. And they were looking for people with my profile and a bunch of different profiles to kind of be in this small team to help launch new health tech companies basically from the ground up. So I was on that team for about 8 months in 2019. And then an in silico drug discovery company that was being incubated like a couple seats down from me in the office was just about to launch. And they needed, you know, some more people to bring on board. And, you know, what I was working on at the time, you know, most startups fail. Fortunately, you know, in this group, most startups fail before they get launched, which is great. That's the whole point of an incubator. But I was able to, you know, pivot and join, you know, Vant AI right before it launched. And I've been with the company ever since. So I was like the 5th or 6th person on the team, about 25 people today. We're a wholly owned subsidiary of Vant Sciences. And we've kind of, you know, pivoted along with the company as they've continued to evolve. So they are now very focused in the area of targeted protein degradation. We have thus developed a lot of really cutting edge computational capabilities specifically for degraders, and that's been our exclusive focus for the last year. I don't think I've told you that's, Rich, but like in the last few weeks, I've actually taken on a second role at Vant, still doing what I'm doing at Vant AI, but now playing, you know, a very similar role in the broader discovery organization at Vant. Now that they've acquired Silicon Therapeutics, that was announced several months back. So I'm now kind of like straddling the two groups, but playing a very similar function.
Great. So Glennis, a word that you mentioned struck me, which was nonlinear. And I think especially growing up, we just all have this perspective that our careers will be linear. And I think that might be because our education system is just so linear, where you start in kindergarten and assuming you don't fail kindergarten, you go to 1st grade and that continues. And then a lot of us go to college. One big decision might be whether to go to grad school or not. Otherwise, it's just linear. Wherever you progress and you know where you're going to be the next year. And I remember long ago that day I first graduated thinking, okay, I'm 21, 22 years old. I've got the whole life. And you still feel like you need to be on a track. And every decision you make is going to keep you going on that same track. And then looking back, I realized I've jumped over.
Yeah.
Just career progression, thinking about the New York City life science scene, just how it's been, you guys have as well, and how it's given you different perspectives on the New York City life science industry. We'll start with Glennis.
So I think from the perspective of being nonlinear and being in New York, I think it's one of the features of most people I know who have ended up in New York. It's part of their life journey, and quite often it's an unexpected part of that life journey. I think from my own experience, I grew up in New York. I left and came back, and I wish I could tell you that was all predicted, but it was not. And I think because New York being historically, the city where if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere, and the wonderful PR that exists for generations to attract people who are adventurous and endeavor to be a part of change. I think it's impacting what we see right now as the life science ecosystem in New York, because we are very, very different, I think, from the Boston, Cambridge area, Bay Area, where there seems to have very well-rounded core competencies. And what's happening with life science in New York, it's not really focused on any particular area. I can't say that New York life scientists focus on therapeutics. It's not IT, it's not biosynthetics. It's kind of a great representation of diversity, which I think is the theme of this city. So yeah, I think from non-linear approaches of career to the diversity of the city being represented there, I think it encompasses very well historically what New York has been known for and represents.
Great. And Anita mentioned that my audio was cutting out. I just turned my Wi-Fi off and on, hoping that'll fix things. But hopefully I'm back. Elsie, your thoughts on a nonlinear career path, especially in the New York City area?
Yeah, that made me smile, Glennis, as you were talking through it. And Danielle, I'd love to hear your insights, because especially as Glennis was talking about this, I feel like your career trajectory across health tech, across therapeutics, and even at Roivant, where you're currently straddling the two roles, is very emblematic. I think it's singular focus, a case study. But before, Rich or I put you on the spot, I'll certainly add my perspective too. I think I'm the only person amongst this group, at least, who is not a scientist. I actually have a background academically in the history of science, but then also somewhat too from a health policy perspective. And here I am in biotech IR, which is so totally not what I thought I'd end up in. But I feel like being in New York City sort of gives you that opportunity where you look around. And right now I sit at the intersection of science and the financial world. So I talk to chief scientific officers, I talk to chief executive officers, I talk to the heads of investment banks, I talk to the heads of VC firms. And I think New York City is such a unique place that really enables that. So it's not just about the intersection of health tech and science, which I'm going to let Danielle talk a little more about, but it's also about the industrial opportunities that biotech, that sort of the ecosystem here in New York City lends to biotech, and that sort of growth. And I'm excited to really see that. I will also give a pitch for the LifeSci NYC internship program, because I'm excited for all the companies that have participated. And I really think the swath and diversity of the types of companies that sort of this audience here are going to work at over the summer really represents the diversity we see.
Danielle?
Yeah, no, of course. I love the way both of you put it. I mean, for me, I think I started out my career in a very traditional path, at least coming out of Penn and the Wharton community. I was definitely going to take that life science bend, but want this very traditional like business consulting route. And I would say the rest is like kind of history. You see the opportunities in front of you at each stage of your career, and you make an individual assessment each time, whether it's a step that you find exciting and interesting, and whether it will send you down a path that you generally find exciting, like for your career, and one where you can imagine yourself longer term. But that calculus changes, at each one of those decision points. So for me, I was approached by Roivant, after being at McKinsey for 2.5 years, wasn't particularly thinking of leaving necessarily. But it sounded really exciting. And I have to tell you, even at that point, I was nervous to leave McKinsey and go to a company that was only 5 years old at the time, still valued at like $7 billion or something. So, now I have a very different perspective, having then launched out of Roivant with a startup with 5 people. So, your perspective changes over time. But now, lots of, there's always changes. You always have to be flexible. They ended up, buying out our employee shares and bringing us back to the parent company. in January, because they were making this much greater investment in discovery and in targeted protein degradation, and wanted us a little closer to home once our strategy became more aligned with theirs. And you just have to, roll with it. Then they make this acquisition. I wasn't consulted, right? But, they brought in this amazing lab in Boston. We didn't have any wet lab capabilities before that. Now I'm like constantly collaborating with their folks in the lab up in Boston and seeing what we can leverage internally versus outsourcing. And it just brings a whole new set of challenges that I've been excited to tackle in the last several months.
Great. You talk perspective, and all three of you have had jobs that have given you great perspective on the industry. Where consulting at McKinsey, you're working with a number of companies and really have to be on top of everything happening in the industry. Same with Elsie, where you're working with so many companies in New York City, both at EDC and now at Stern IR. And Glennis, the same, working in an incubator where you just need to really be on top of the industry. Wondering, and want to start with Danielle, your perspectives from McKinsey and now, how you compare where New York City is with other markets, and obviously the Bay Area and California, as well as the Boston, Cambridge, and broader Massachusetts areas have been New York City's big competition, where the LifeSci NYC initiative is really intended to put us on equal footing with those other areas. What are you seeing that's different about New York City? Where do you see the opportunities in New York City compared to the other markets?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question. And when I joined McKinsey, I always used to put up this pie chart of like which industries were most dominant in the city. And it was, the metric was like by number of McKinsey projects, right? And so you always have like financial services is like this massive chunk of the pie. And then you have all these other industries, right? If you look at the Boston pie chart, it's like 67% life sciences, so it's like a very different makeup. But I think what was very interesting as I went through my time at the firm is that financial services in New York, it was always this big chunk, but it never really grew, never really shrank. It was kind of just, there. Of course, that's, what New York's known for. And same goes for the Boston area. It was always kind of that same big chunk. But over time, you saw the healthcare sector in New York slowly becoming a much greater part of the pie. In terms of projects coming out of the New York office. So in my mind, that makes being in New York for the life sciences very exciting, because it's not this very stable, established, ecosystem like the Cambridge area where you have the big players and they're the rocks, and you're going to spend some time working at Biogen or Takeda, and then maybe you'll work at a startup, but then you'll like venture back to those big companies. In New York, it's constant. It's just been evolving. Like my last several years living and working in New York, and the growth has just been tremendous. And I think, what more exciting place to be than a place that's, kind of nascent in its growth and growing a ton.
Glennis, how is it operating an incubator in New York? And also, you're working closely with EDC. So what's your perspective on where New York is? How much are you seeing competition where companies are deciding between New York and Boston or elsewhere? And just what are you seeing from your perspective?
Yeah, so really interesting question, because it goes to the heart of all the growth trajectories that we're trying to accomplish. Fundamentally, as an incubator, we are interacting with companies and founders early in their development and their life cycle. And at this stage, there's an idea, there's a company, there's some funding that's been acquired. And what we're seeing is that Cambridge, frankly, is outpacing the level of activity at this stage. But what I'm finding is that companies that are already established are looking for a footprint in New York. So if they're already operational, if they've already gone through the clinical stage, if they're close to being approved, they're looking at future talent acquisition. They're looking at being in the right place at the right time to affect market dynamics, et cetera. And so they have an eye to New York. What's interesting is they're looking for their C-suite to be positioned in New York. And these are anecdotal based on conversations I've had. They're looking for some of their sales and services to be in New York, but the foundational aspect, the early stage companies, I think really have a preference based on where they originate from. So for example, if someone comes out of Boston and starts a company, generally there's a preference for them to be there. And I think the growth of New York will likely come from, number one, New York being more attractive and being a place where people want to be and want to live, who have that adventurous spirit and want to start companies, and also from the academic labs and the individuals much like yourselves who at some point decide, okay, we're going to start a company and are residing in New York.
And Elsie, especially I'm curious, both now and when you were at EDC, what was the perspective of New York versus other markets? And like, did you go in every day and did Doug say, like, have a cheer, we're going to beat Boston? Or, what was the view of Boston and how did New York City see its ability to compete?
Yeah, I am a born and raised New Yorker and then ended up working for the city, and I'm still very, very much, you know, a big champion of all things New York City biotech. So I could go on about this question for hours. And the way I at least sort of see Boston is that it is, like both of you, Glennis, Danielle have said, is that it is very established. There is that ecosystem. People are in their foci areas. But the exciting thing about New York City is that it's so early stage and dynamic and so high growth all at the same time that opportunities arise in places where you would never expect. And also in that same way, we've seen companies do that as well. So one of the favorite companies that I and many across the New York City ecosystem love to talk about is Schrodinger. I feel like it's this case study where the science is intersectional. The science is also widely applicable. They are a therapeutics company. They are also a materials company in a lot of ways. They've succeeded wildly. And I think there are so many opportunities for companies like Vant also to really play a star role where they can reach across industries, across areas of healthcare, materials, engineering, therapeutics, et cetera, and really do that. I think New York City is so well positioned. So that's sort of my first, pitch for it. And secondly, I think at the same time, Glennis, you might be seeing this too, but I think international companies especially are looking to move to New York City in some way, shape, or form, whether it's a bench at BioLabs or even a desk at BioLabs, because they know that New York City is at the end of the day the financial capital of the world. So their science might be based elsewhere, their founders might be in London from a lab perspective, but at the same time, having a place in New York City is meaningful as a company when you're trying to grow. So I think those are really the two facets where we can see New York City being a high growth area and really developing its brand as a hotspot for biotech over the next several years, a decade plus, in both the intersectionality of biotech areas as well as sort of the financial connections that can be made here.
Yeah, and I think also healthcare, to add, is which we sometimes don't have under the umbrella of life science, is also another fast growing sector in the city as well. So you've got a lot of companies that are just reinventing approaches to health prevention, health management, health maintenance, and those are not requiring laboratory, they're not requiring R&D primarily, but they are here in large numbers.
What do you think will be the biggest growth areas in the city, and what are the biggest hindrances? I know one of them, and a real focus for EDC and what Glennis is doing, is just providing real estate for startups. But now that New York City has been expanding, there are many more places available. What kinds of companies do you think will be emerging, we're going to start seeing? And what do you think some of the challenges that still remain are?
I can, so we're looking at this actually rather closely these days, because as we surveyed the population of potential applicants for our site, we're seeing an interesting intersection between the core industries, or the traditional core industries of New York, and some of the applicants. So for example, fashion. So where does biotech intersect with the fashion industry? So we're seeing a few companies that are working on synthetic materials that are created through bioprocesses, fermentation, etc., that actually ultimately have end user in the fashion industry that's very strong here. And I think we could actually leverage that and broadcast that a bit more to increase its representation in the biotech and life science field in New York, for example.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with that and say the sort of intersectionality is a big one. And I know, Glennis, you can probably talk a little bit more about C16 and the success that they've seen recently coming out of BioLabs. But to sort of add to that, since I know we've talked a lot about intersectionality in the past sort of half hour or so, the other thing that I'd see too is really the growth of companies that are coming from our young talent out of universities. So a big statistic that people don't talk enough about, at least in my opinion, is that New York City universities are collectively have second the amount of grant funding to the Boston, Cambridge area universities. And that is a incredible number. Last I checked, as of 2020, New York City universities collectively were awarded more than $2 billion in NIH grant funding, which is an astounding number and will feed so many more companies down the pipe. And now that we have more of a landing pad for those companies coming out of academic institutions, we do have the opportunity to see sort of PhDs in the lab right now generating those ideas and being able to walk across the street and say, hey, Glennis, I have an idea, you have an incubator, how can you help me? And now that we have these types of resources that are out there, we're going to be able to support the nascent companies that are right now potentially sitting in the audience here.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no. So I'm sorry to interrupt you. I was just going to comment on the point about challenges, right, in New York. And I think, one of the things I've led for the last year and a half at Vant AI is talent acquisition and recruiting more broadly. And what we found is people who are in, let's say, the latter half of their career, very experienced, heavily concentrated in the Boston area for biotech specifically, do not want to relocate. They're very much ingrained in the ecosystem there. So where we've had a lot of luck recruiting, very much piggybacking on what Elsie was saying, was in the universities in the New York and Philadelphia areas. And, obviously through the LifeSci New York City internship program, but even for, our full-time hires who are graduating from, we hire a lot of PhDs in med chem, comp bio, et cetera. There are a lot of people in schools in this area who don't want to move up to Boston for family reasons or whatever reasons. They're excited by the growth in New York City. And I think the more we bring those people who are just starting off their careers into companies in this area, the longer they'll spend their careers here, and it will just, aid that growth of the whole sector in the area.
Yeah.
Any words of wisdom for, oh, go ahead, Elsie.
I was going to briefly steal a talking point from Nancy Thornberry, who is a CEO of Calliope, one of the best biotechs, in my opinion, personal opinion, in New York City out there at the moment. Something that I've heard her say in panels and fireside chats, much like these, is that anecdotally, she's been able to retain the talent she's hired, whereas a lot of CEOs in the Boston, Cambridge area find their young best talent hopping to and from biotechs, because there is that opportunity. And while there are those types of opportunities here in New York, I think people find their nook and their home and want to grow and stay at the companies that they are at for a while, more so than elsewhere.
Yeah.
Any words of wisdom for our class of interns of what they should do to prepare for careers in the New York City area? And obviously they've taken the most important first step of getting accepted into the LifeSci NYC internship program. But any other thoughts and recommendations for them just to thrive in New York City?
I would say New York City has a diversity of opportunities. Take full advantage of that. There's a diversity of influence, take full advantage of that. And there's a diversity of distractions, which I would actually say take advantage of that, because it does expand your horizon perspective and allows you to bring interesting things back into your experience and your work.
I will add to that and say, taking advantage of certainly the early stage nature of our ecosystem, because I've found the community of New York City biotech players here is so small that everyone is so friendly and everyone knows each other. And that is really quite a benefit, in that the relationships that you build here, whether it's in this Zoom room or in with your classmates or internship cohort or elsewhere, stick with you. And I can say that some of the people I've met in the biotech space earlier in my career are some of my close friends, and that I think has really paid off and is very meaningful on a professional and personal level.
I would say try to get to know your LifeSci New York City internship class as well as you possibly can. Learn about what their companies are doing, what their experiences are like in their internships. I think through this network, you will be able to learn a lot about what's going on in the life sciences community in New York City. And I think that's quite powerful.
One thing we did last night at our kickoff reception was we had a number of companies host breakout rooms, and the interns could just wander around and visit people, meet with each other, as well as meet with people from the companies. And we're thinking of doing that on a regular basis, of just having happy hours where people can show up and really make it open to everyone, from this current year's interns, alumni, people at companies, and just anyone in the ecosystem, just as a way of building the ecosystem. Question for you, what parts of the ecosystem do you see as most vibrant, and what do you see as good ways of breaking into the New York City ecosystem and building, apart from this program, what else do you see as ways of just building networks within the New York City ecosystem? And also a related question, how would you compare our ecosystem to those of other cities? And especially to the extent that you've seen what's happening in Boston or elsewhere.
I guess I can jump in and say that breaking into networks, this program is one of the best network building elements, especially for young talent in New York City right now. So I would definitely start here, and you all have been accepted and are excited to be a part of it. And we're excited to have you be a part of that family too. On top of that, there's also, each one of the incubators, BioLabs, JLabs, et cetera, has their own sort of events that they host on a regular basis, whether it's in person during non-pandemic times or virtually during pandemic times. Would highly recommend tapping into those, even if there isn't a networking opportunity at the end. A lot of times you'll learn about something that you didn't think about before, whether it's a term sheet or the latest and greatest in computational biology. And also New York Bio does, I think, maybe a free annual or biannual networking event that they run beautifully. And it's really a great opportunity to meet people from all over, whether they are lawyers working on IP transactions or the head of R&D at a company or a CFO. So I think they do a really good job of facilitating those types of relationships.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I would add to that. So that there are a host of networking events. You have the accelerators, Indie Bio, as an example. You have programs that incubators such as ourselves do. And there's also, I believe, Bio has a Tuesday morning seminar every Tuesday morning, and I've checked into that every once in a while, and it's an opportunity to introduce yourself to the panelist. And I think what's amazing is that you generally have access to individuals. Much to Elsie's point, everyone's friendly, open, and very much supportive of questions, comments, connections, etc.
I would say, and this is very tilted to those of you who are, very science oriented, but look up the top labs at all the schools in the New York City area. Most of them have spun out like a small company, or, maybe they've licensed out some sort of technology that will help you get a sense, I think, of what, the latest tech is coming out of the schools in the area, which frequently is connected to the most innovative, cutting edge companies also in the city. So I know that's something that I did a lot of when I was on the Roy Van Health team, and we're constantly at Vant AI trying to partner with companies that have recently launched out of universities.
So we got a question sent to me. What makes a biotech company successful as a team? And I think especially in New York City, where a lot of the companies are still emerging, what have you seen is important to build a team?
Can you repeat the question, Rich? I think you were breaking up a bit.
Oh, I'm sorry. What makes a biotech company successful as a team?
Oh, okay. I can speak from my own experience. I think having clear delineation of roles and responsibilities, but still maintaining a flat organization is really important. How much by when is my mantra. And it's just having everyone on the same page in terms of responsibilities and goals, I think goes a far way.
And I think related to that, diversity of perspective and experience, and that kind of paves the way to have those delineated roles and responsibilities, because, you know, this person's the expert in this, they're most natural to do this. But, you know, at the same time, having enough overlap among the team that you can all speak the same language. And, you know, I think that common language is science, just general knowledge of the industry a lot of times. But I think, you know, you never want to be at a company where everyone studied the same thing in the same lab. You won't get very far.
One thing I like to sort of remind myself and others too all the time is looking around at other people and your colleagues' backgrounds and reminding yourself that regardless of age and tenure, everyone brings a different lens and set of experience. So I think really integrating that and highlighting everyone's strengths and using them to the best of their abilities and where they want to be deployed and learn and grow is definitely one of the best ways to build a strong team.
I would also say, picking up on the word Yale used of diversity, New York City just has a big advantage in that we just have a much more diverse population. And it's great seeing different perspectives going into the industry. Another question we got from you is, we talked about Boston a lot, but how does New York City LifeSci industry compare with California?
I think, so BioLabs, we have incubators in LA and San Diego. And I think those are all pretty robust in terms of the type of companies. It's a similar profile, but again, most of it is focused on therapeutics and healthcare. I think where we find ourselves distinguishing, again, even within the BioLabs network, is that we seem to have quite a bit of the unorthodox life science here, which is to my point that I made earlier, that diversity.
So I'm going to take a brief pause and want to do a group shot of the panelists. And I found that if you do candids, they never come out on Zoom. So I'm going to count to 3. 1, 2, smile. Perfect. What would you change about New York City? If there anything that you think the city still needs to develop or that needs to be done. And I mentioned at the intro for Glennis, one thing that you've done, which is so fabulous, is make it easier for companies to host interns through the LifeSci NYC internship program at BioLabs, where the cost of hosting an intern and paying for their desk was a prohibitive factor. And we've heard from a number of companies that because of you're doing that, we've just gotten many more interns placed at BioLabs. So really appreciate that. And I know like one of the big challenges in New York is real estate. Any other thoughts on things that you would do to change and help the New York City life sciences ecosystem emerge?
Yeah, I've given a lot of thought to this, as you can imagine. So how much time do you have?
We have 4 minutes and we go into overtime. But
I think one of the first things is to let people know of the resources available. So I've mentored a few companies, and most of them are not aware of Startup New York. They're not aware of these services. And I think if EDC can do a much better job broadcasting what's available, not just to companies, but to individuals, to scientists, to postdocs and students who may be having an idea and not really sure how to translate that idea to fruition, to actually start a company, build a team, etc. I think that would go a long way, helping generate new ventures. There are many. I think the university systems, I think tech ventures are well-oiled machines that are doing such a great job training their community in entrepreneurship, in IP management, etc. And I think having that type of training available to people who are not in the halls of Columbia or Cornell would be a wonderful advantage.
And to build off of that a little bit too, in my time, both at Stern, but also at the EDC, I've talked just sort of one-on-one in a one-off mentorship capacity to a lot of young talent that's interested in breaking into biotech in New York City, particularly for typically personal or family reasons, just because they want to move back, in New York City is probably the best place to be if you're in your 20s, quite frankly. And they come into these conversations without, not a ding at any individual in particular, but without any sort of knowledge of the incubators and where their startups are and whatnot, because there isn't necessarily a area that they would have tapped on to have that without sort of a conversation with individuals and whatnot. So I think maybe integrating young talent in a way and exposing them to opportunities specific to New York City and where you can find those job postings, find those companies, and find those opportunities would be a really great value add. And Rich, I know you and the rest of your team are already doing this, so, and doing a great job of it. So I don't mean to beat the dead horse.
Yeah, no, I'm just hearing what you're saying. I'm thinking of so much more that we could be doing in partnership with EDC.
I agree with everything that has been said. And I think also, I just keep going back to partnering with, universities in New York and in surrounding areas to bring their talent here, send them here, help connect them to companies and opportunities in the New York area. And, that was actually, one of the things when I was in college. We had so many opportunities coming our way, in the biotech scene, but there wasn't a cohesive message from New York, or there, it wasn't dominated by New York. It was, as has been mentioned, a lot of Boston and California. And if you wanted to go to New York, you kind of had to find those opportunities yourself. And I think that may just be a numbers game. But I feel like actively reaching out, especially to the departments at universities that are, in New York or like within an hour or two, would be amazing.
Any final thoughts? We've got 1 minute left. Any last tips for the interns?
Have an awesome summer.
Yeah.
Yay, it sounds like COVID, it seems at least like COVID is a lot more behind us now than it was last summer for sure. And, so just enjoy every minute, enjoy being outside. The city is still very much alive, so enjoy.
And getting more so.
Yes, yeah. We're probably not going to do indoor events as a program this summer, but we're talking about doing outdoor pizza parties. And we'll definitely be inviting you guys.
Yeah.
Amazing.
And
great.
I wanted to say with obstacle comes opportunity. So I think COVID and the transition that we're going through and the fact that not everyone has got their feet on the ground quite so securely, I think is a great opportunity.
Yeah, and if nothing else, I mean, the city's completely recognized the importance of this industry. Yeah. And it's such a priority right now. Which creates so much opportunity. And it's just amazing seeing what's come out of New York City in the past year.
One thing, just goes on that I'll say about the life sciences industry generally, because people always ask me this, does it go through like economic downturns, like the rest of the economy? That's why New York City and so many other cities are trying to boost their life sciences industry. It's by and large a very stable industry. Yes, companies have their ups and downs, individual companies, especially when we're talking about drugs, something comes off patent, it goes down. If it, they have a launch, it's like shoots up. And, all the different companies in the healthcare space have, growth cycles like that. But the industry overall, we're all humans. We always need healthcare. It doesn't matter if the stock market's down or the housing market's down. And so that's why it's such an important rock to have in the city as we look towards recovery post-pandemic.
Yeah, and if you look at any economic impact analysis graph and compare tech or industrials or biotech or whatnot, with every economic crisis, biotech and healthcare have always recovered more quickly. And I think as we all, I think, have experienced, the pandemic has only served to bring more cash into biotech than ever before. It is amazing, incredible growth, and has made all of our lives topsy-turvy based on the number of hours I'm sure all of us have worked as a result. But it is truly incredible and really, I want to say, a privileged place to be in.
Perfect place to end it. Thank you all so much. This has been fabulous. Really appreciate your sharing time with us, and look forward to continuing to work with all of you. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Bye. Have a great weekend, everyone.